Welcome everyone to this session of the Home Affairs Select Committee inquiry into Islamophobia. Can I welcome our first panel for giving evidence to us today? Could I ask you both to introduce yourselves and also the organisations that you represent? Ms. Atta.
Iman, Atta, Director of Telmama.
Miqdaad, Versi, spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you just to sort of reflect initially for us on what you see as the scale of Islamophobia that you see across the country, and also trends that you are seeing at the moment. Ms. Atta.
So we within Telmama have been recorded Islamophobia and anti-Muslim attacks since 2012. Since 2015, we've seen a rise in reported incidents to ourselves, but as well to police forces. That rise is attributed to multiple factors. One is the rise of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, but also we have...
Sorry, could you speak up slightly?
Yep.
I think your microphone is not picking up quite as much as the other microphone, so you might just have to, apologies, you might have to just speak a little bit louder.
I'll come closer as well. So we've been seeing an increase in the reports that we've been receiving. Equally, police forces have been receiving an increase in reports of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. From 2015 to where we are today, year on year, we have seen a sharp increase in reported incidents on a street level. So incidents that are called offline, between 30% to 50%. And that increase is attributed to multiple factors. We've got really the rise of racism, of anti-Muslim hatred. We've got media, we've got social media, we've got the rise of populism, far right, and we've got trigger events that are an attributing factor to, as well, a driver to anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. What are these incidents? What do we see? Majority of the incidents that take place are incidents that are abusive behavior in nature. So over 50% of these cases are abusive behavior in nature. Nevertheless, we see year on year there's an increase in physical aggression and an increase in discrimination cases. So in the last 2 years, we've seen from the reports that we received an increase of over 100% in discrimination cases towards Muslim communities. And that's something to look at and really to worry. So that whatever used to be a covert type of discrimination today is becoming more overt.
And is that employment discrimination? Is that public services discrimination? What sort of...
Employment discrimination as well as public service discrimination. And let's not forget as well, when we look at anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, it's gendered. So women are the number one target, are the number one victim of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia, and that is attributed to two reasons. One, sexism, misogyny. Usually the male feels that he can have a go at that woman who is wearing a headscarf, or who is wearing a face veil, or who is just a woman with a dark color. It's a male to female violence and symptomatic, as well as that female is visibly Muslim, i.e. wearing the face veil or wearing the headscarf, or really being from an Asian background or a dark background. 66% of the perpetrators that are reported into us are male, and 58% of the victims are female. This seems to be the case year on year, and this trend seems to always reinforce itself. And one of the things to note as well about the perpetrators is that in our 2017 data and equally in the 2018 data, what we're seeing is that the younger generation have got a high percentage of perpetrating that hate. I.e. in our 2017 data, 22% of the 66% male perpetrators were between the ages of 13 to 18. And this is something definitely to highlight and to look at the role of social media and how that plays, and to look at really how can we work more on the education level to actually work on the prevention of such racism and attacks to take place.
Thank you. Mr. Versi.
Thank you very much. I think that Iman's covered a lot of the different areas in terms of some of the trends. It's worth highlighting some of the social attitudes in the polling data, just to supplement what Iman had mentioned. When you look at the range of different polls out there, which sort of look at the perception of Muslims in society, you see things like a third of the population believing in conspiracy theories about Muslims, like there are these no-go zones where non-Muslims can't enter, there's these Sharia no-go zones. You know, these types of conspiracy theories are quite prevalent. I mean, a third of the population believing this stuff. It gets even further worse when you get into the idea that Muslim immigration to this country is somehow a plan to take over. You know, a fifth of the population believe that. But even when it comes to young children, 31% of young children think the Muslims are taking over England. And, we're not, but this is a serious problem. I mean, a third of the young children and wider society.
What age are those children?
This was the age between 10 and 14, and the largest survey ever done by The Guardian a couple of years ago. These aren't small figures. They're worrying figures. And the fact that you have such large numbers that come out from broad polling on this issue suggests there is a serious problem that needs to be tackled, which is more than just mere hatred on the street. Not that that's not a major issue that needs to be dealt with, but these societal problems in terms of the broader racism within society is something that needs to be looked at very carefully.
And just reflecting a bit further on those figures around the 10 to 14-year-olds, the other figures around the 13 to 18-year-olds being responsible. Do you think that has got worse, or do you think that's just being measured now?
I think it's both at the same time. So it's definitely measured now because we're focusing more on racism, focusing more on hate crimes, things are getting more reported. And people are coming more forward and reporting, and that's one factor actually why we're seeing that rise as well. But two, as well, we have social media that's come in the recent 10 years. It's become kind of the popular thing that will be as well the problem for the coming 10 years, where actually as well kids pick up on a lot of things. Kids tend to hear their parents say at home a lot of things, and all they have to do is, although they don't come with any prejudice, is just repeat those words next day in schools. In Salmama, we receive 1 in 10 cases from schools, i.e. from parents where their children would have suffered a type of racism or bullying or anti-Muslim attack, or within the staff. But that is educational institutions, and that is mainly schools. So that is something definitely as well to look at in terms of the education system. And when you start to speak to schools about this and flag this and talk to them about this, schools fear the fact to say that they have issues with race and hate crimes because of Ofsted, because of the name of the school is not going to be good enough for people to enroll in them. But nevertheless, there is that underlying problem that they have to tackle. We do offer mediation between schools and parents, and we do offer workshops around bullying, racism, and highlighting all types of racism, because a lot from the workshops that we deliver in schools, when we deliver it to students, a lot comes out beyond anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia. A lot comes out around homophobia, around anti-Semitism, around racism, around even the looks of the kids. So a lot comes out that needs to be dealt with in the education system that unfortunately is not yet dealt with.
And I think that we see this with groups like Childline. There have been a number of different reports that have come out from Childline talking about the fact that they have received greater numbers of calls about this Islamophobia in some respect. So I think that the latest figures haven't yet come out, so I haven't got them to hand. But they are a very good organisation who track this and look at this and see the kind of racism that they see in schools.
And in terms of what schools are doing to respond to this, what proportion of schools, do you have any estimate of what proportion of schools that you all think are responding well to it or have policies in place to respond to it?
I think not every school has got policies in place to respond to it. We do have engagement with the schools, specifically when they receive a letter from our end and the letter is a bit threatening. That's when they react to things. But there are schools that do not even take that letter seriously, and we had to call them and name them out in newspapers. We gave them the chance to actually speak to us, speak to the families, mediate, and when we saw it's at that end, we did name them and shame them. And that's a problem, because that kid does not only suffer that racism in the school, that kid ends up suffering that racism down on the streets. We had cases in the north of the country where we had a refugee family who had many levels of racism and discrimination. They are refugees from Syria, they are Muslims, but they do not belong to the majority of the Muslim communities here from an Asian background. They are Middle Eastern. So they had multiple levels of discrimination and racism in the school. One from the staff themselves and within other members of their school, from kids, for them being refugees, because they were highlighted as being refugees when they actually entered the school. That's one. Two, from the kids within other Muslim backgrounds in the school that actually regarded them as non-Muslim because they look different, they act differently, the mother looks different. So you've got multiple elements that we have to look at when we look at racism and bullying in schools and how it's looked at, and the background of the individuals and the backgrounds in the schools and the staff that is there, and what policies do they have. Some of them even do not know that some of the words that are being used are even racist. I mean, the head teacher was like, that's not racist. I'm like, that is racist. So, and that as well comes back to the education that staff need to get, training that staff need to get for them to address these things. And I understand sometimes resources are tight. I understand sometimes there's maternity leaves and people and cover and this, but there are basic training around racism and bullying that teachers and staff need to have in place for them to address this issue. That is actually a growing phenomenon in our schools.
I think when you keep on hearing the same type of tropes coming out, the same type of language, and still that not being really understood, Muslims are terrorists, this has been going on for a while. And the same types of things come up again and again and again, and we don't seem to... It feels like if a third of young children believe that Muslims are taking over England, and that's not even fully appreciated within many sections of schools across the country, and that doesn't seem to be getting better, then we really aren't doing as well as we should be in preparing the young children for the real life our life that we all live in.
Do you have examples of schools that you work with that you think are doing a good job and have good systems in place?
We do have a few schools in South London. We do have a few schools in Manchester, definitely, that we're happy to share the names and actually put practices in place. We do have schools in Stoke-on-Trent as well that are happy to talk about this subject and happy to address it, but also welcome us going in to deliver workshops to talk about it. And that's very important.
If you had any just examples, not even necessarily the names of the schools, but the kinds of things that they do that you think are good practice that work, that would be really helpful if you were able to send those. Kate Green.
I'd like to ask first some questions about hate crime. And I think you were talking a few moments ago, Iman, about the increase in reported hate crime. First of all, how worrying is that for Muslims hearing about a rise in hate crime? And what impact is it having on them, even if they're not directly victims of such hate crime? Is it impacting their behaviour, or how are they regarding it?
Hate speech has got huge impact on communities, has got a huge impact on the victim, on their families, on their friends, on their neighbours, on everyone. I'm going to pick up on the recent spike that we've seen in reported incidents, which was unfortunately following the New Zealand terrorist attack, which was an attack on Muslim communities, where we have seen a 600% increase in reports into us that were anti-Muslim in nature. That's an astonishing thing to see. 51 individuals that are Muslims have been killed. Nevertheless, Muslim communities here in the UK still have received a spike in the hatred towards them. Whether it's statements that you deserve it, whether it's your turn now to get it, whether it's people being called terrorists. That is worrying, because a female who's being abused on the street just because she is a female and she is Muslim, for her to pick up for a price of someone else who claims to be Muslim and commits atrocities, that's not fair on that individual. We've seen victims end up with anxiety, depression. Victims end up with suicidal. We've had victims who had suicidal tendencies. We've had victims who had financial damages. When you have vandalism, when you have your household or property damaged, or your institution, your mosque is damaged, you've got financial elements into that. But one thing we need to look at as well, when one of the things that victims always tend to tell us when they're being abused, walking down the street or in bus stop, as much as the hate incident that they have received is bad, what is worse for them is the 15 people watching on the side, them being abused and not doing anything. So the bystander element. They say that's not the society we live in. That's not what we expect from the communities that we live with. That's the community that we're part of. And that's something that we need to look at, because yes, that female victim or that male is feeling anxious, emotionally disturbed, carrying this hate with them all the time, but their children that are watching them being abused day in, day out. Their financial impact that is being affected, their mobility. We had women that had to change their routes to work because of the abuse they're getting on a daily basis. We had women that had to change the way they look, either take their headscarf off or wear hats instead, because of the abuse that they're getting on a daily basis. But going back, what happens to those children that actually are saying that the society is giving up on them, is not doing anything for them? What ideas do these kids then start pulling out in their heads? What are the drivers that actually would pull out those kids to actually feel, I'm not wanted for an identity that I carry, one of multiple identities that I carry? And this has, from what we're saying, this sometimes actually at one point feels that Muslim communities need to be on their own to try to defend themselves. and not part of a society that actually they belong to and are part and parcel of. And that's something that impacts our community cohesion in so many ways. We had victims that spoke to us about hate that they would have received online, and then when they report it or they talk about it, people tell them, well, it's just online, just close your account and you can live with it. The impact on victims is unmeasurable. We don't know what that victim lives at that moment in time. We don't know what their emotional status is, and we don't know how that's going to impact them moving forward. Does that person decide to shut his connections or her connections with the wider society? Is that not going to create that element of a them and us narrative? We have to look at it in so many ways.
The only thing I think I'd add is that the EHRC did a report, and they found that 70% of Muslims had reported they had experienced religion-based prejudice in the last year. 70% according to the EHRC report. Now that's astonishingly high. And I think another study I saw said that basically every Muslim out there knows people who've suffered some form of prejudice or racism in some way. I mean, if it's that normalized, it becomes a very different mentality as to how you therefore deal with it. And I think that, specifically picking up on one thing Iman said, the bystander element is really the big thing. I mean, the number of people who I've spoken to who, you know, they've suffered some sort of hate crime, but literally the first thing they say, but no one came to help me. Because, you know, we've all been brought up in a society where, you know, everyone's our friend, you've been working, you know, you're part and parcel of society, and you feel that when that happens to you and no one's going to even stand up, and I think the number of cases where that's happened, I think is really, really hurtful, more than not saying that the hate crime itself isn't, but that really hurts.
I'm really interested in what you said there about the HRC saying 70% of Muslims have experienced and reported having experienced hatred or abuse. And I wanted to ask you about reporting. As you may know, I represent a constituency with a significant Muslim population, and I've been quite surprised by how limited their knowledge is of reporting routes. They haven't heard of Tell Mama often. I'm the one who tells them about it. I don't have a sense of how confident they are in reporting to the police. I don't have a sense that there's widespread awareness of third-party reporting routes. And I wonder if you'd like to comment on both the community's knowledge of how to and why they should report, and what could be done to improve reporting, both in terms of mechanisms and people's confidence to do so.
I mean, in the many outreach events that Mama does across the country, one of the things that we always see when we speak to individuals that yes, they have suffered a type of racism or Islamophobia, but they never knew that they could report it. They feel that something that I've been hearing maybe for 10, 15 years, walking down the street, being called a terrorist or the headscarf being pulled off, but they never thought that actually there is a law that can protect them on this. They never knew there's ways to report it. On the element of how to report and how to increase the reporting, more and more when we are sharing, as well as police forces are sharing, as well as Crown Prosecution are sharing success stories around racism and hatred, people are becoming more and more confident to come and report. Not necessarily that every single report that we receive goes to police forces. We've had cases where victims have gone to police forces, did not get the result they want, and then they've come to us to reopen these cases. And we've had cases where victims reported into us, they felt they cannot trust the police. They do not want to go to authorities and report to them for many reasons. Some of which, and let's not forget that we have over 3 million Muslims in the country, come from super diverse backgrounds. Some of them might come from countries where the police is not there to serve their communities, so that perception of the police is going to be there to help me is not there. Some of them might have a previous experience with police forces, might be on a theft case that did not work out well, they did not get that treatment and feel, oh no, I don't want to go and report it to police forces. And some think that it is a waste of time of police forces and resources. And that's something that we're trying to change. Again, when people report into us, we give them the option to keep their data confidential with us as a third party. Some of them, and majority, wish their data not to go to police forces, but some are happy for us to liaise on their behalf with police forces, or actually continue to follow up with them through the journey and provide them with the support from us in Tell Mama, but at the same time pass on their details to police forces for them as well to follow up on them and us to follow up that journey. And the more we speak about what is happening in the country, the more we speak about the laws and legislations that are there to protect our communities, the more we highlight where racism is being addressed, the more victims will come forward to report. And that is attributable to that's the number one factor to the rise that we see in the reports coming into us. People are seeing this is something that we need to speak about, that we need to address, and that authorities need to take seriously.
Would you like the police to be doing things differently? Are there things you think police should do more or less of, or in another way?
So I think the police have gone way beyond where they were. If I take it a few years back when even Salmama started, there's still a long way for them to go. But I think more and more police forces are becoming more and more hands-on on how to deal with hate crimes and hate incidents. But the one thing we need to look at into police forces, again, resources are limited. Sometimes the trained police officers and police forces on hate crimes, they tend to change. So you've lost that training and that knowledge. So where does that go? And how do we keep that within those police forces? And the work with agencies like Salmama is really learning about the keywords, learning about the language. So Salmama offers training to police forces to really showcase what we're seeing in terms of trends and keywords in the data that we're getting, because sometimes a police officer might not really understand some of the nuances around the language that Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred is out there. And we're there to help them and support them equally in order to increase that knowledge within them, but also offer them the training that specializes in that kind of hatred.
The one thing I'd say really needs to happen, I think, is a real push on the marketing of the fact that you can report. There's so... as was said, there are people who think that if you report, nothing's going to happen, although I think that's getting better in some places. But even people who you'd expect better from, people who are counsellors. A counsellor just this week was attacked on the street. And many people seem to not want to report or think that they aren't aware of it. Sometimes they find the online reporting website more difficult to use, but some of them just don't know about it. And I think that's one of the biggest areas that will stop greater numbers coming through. And until that changes, I think we'll often see huge numbers, huge spikes coming up, but that still will only be a small proportion of the actual hate being felt on the street.
And what, if anything, could government do to help promote awareness of reporting routes?
I think there's a lot of different avenues that this can happen through, whether it's through different mosque networks or whether it is more publicly through different... when government says something, very often, sometimes it is listened to from the broader public. And I think that especially through networks that already exist. I think a report came out this week or last week which said that 70% of Muslims go to the mosque at least once a month. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. It seems too high for me. But there's a report that came out doing it based on a large poll done, which seems way too high to me. But anyway, if that's even partially true, even if that's double what it should be, that still is a large proportion of people who will be reached in some way through a mosque network. And I think that that's a very important way to try and reach people.
And you've spoken, I think, Iman, of the rise in hate incidents after major events, attacks. What should be done in the aftermath of such attacks to try and break the pattern of that rise in hateful responses?
I think strong political leadership and messages coming out to actually bring communities together and addressing communities on issues of racism is important. We've seen that, and we've done a study even following the Westminster attack. We've done a study to showcase how the spike that we've seen was minimal compared to the spike following the London Bridge attack, the Manchester Arena attack, and other attacks following that. And it's because of the response from police forces, governmental officials, the Mayor of London, communities. So the engagement with communities, the messaging with communities, the political leadership that was put in place, and the messaging going out to the wider public was nuanced, was a message of us all standing together.
Could I press you a little more on that? Because in Manchester, where I'm an MP, I thought both the political leadership from the Mayor Andy Burnham and the police, particularly the Chief Constable Ian Hopkins, was very strong in the immediate aftermath of the Arena attack. So what was missing in Manchester?
It was indeed in Manchester itself, but not in the outskirts of Manchester. So the majority of the reports that we received following the Manchester Arena attack, and it was one of the highest spikes that by far we've seen, which is 700% increase in reports into Talmama post-Manchester, a week post-Manchester, was coming from the outskirts around Manchester, Greater Manchester. And the focus was on Manchester itself, but not on the other areas. And that's something to look at, while the messaging that came out from London, and they did put a plan in place for 14 days following the Westminster attack, which I think it's a model that most probably needs to be followed, picked up on, and adapted to the context and adapted to the different regions and cities across the country, because that showed that although there was a spike and there was a backlash, but that was minimal, and that was an attack on Westminster, on Parliament, on our democracy, and people lost their lives, and the first of many during that year. But still, that spike was minimal compared to the rest. And I think the awareness raising around even reporting them was on the increase. So people were aware that they can report. The messaging of unity came out very strongly. Communities came out very strongly, equally following Manchester. But that was the second attack. Kids lost their lives. Yes. Horrific attack that people were highly emotionally driven, that actually people were angry.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is the way that the media or sections of the media have reported some of these incidents makes a big difference as to how I think many within the broader public might understand the situation better. Of course, there is a non-mainstream media, social media bubble for some people within certain elements of the far right who may not be that influenced by sort of mainstream media. But many sections of mainstream media, when some of these reports come out, when some of the incidents happen, some of them have been very, very good in nuancing the way that they talk about it, and others have been, let's say, not so good, using very inflammatory language, having hugely problematic opinion columns which really don't reflect anything about the society that we live in, not reporting on the really important solidarity work that is happening from communities and the mayors of London and political leadership. So when you have all of these things together not happening within certain sections of media, which then flows into some of the elements of the far right, or even actually not even people who would be considered to be far right but seem to have these attitudes now starting to become ingrained in them, that's the problem that I think that needs to be really carefully looked at, because people perceive and understand hate crime. Well, hate crime occurs very often because of the way people perceive Muslims, and studies have shown that the way that happens very often is because of the political leadership and media.
So what's your view of the rhetoric of politicians and the way in which it's heard and felt by Muslim communities? Have you got examples where politicians have either given very good leadership or have made statements that have been difficult for the community?
I think there are lots of examples of bad practice. I think, let me start with a good practice. I think after the Finsbury Park attack, different, I agree. The Prime Minister was very good. She came out, she engaged with communities there. She talked about Islamophobia being a serious challenge that needs to be dealt with. She was a leader that we all very much welcomed, the actions that she took, and generally how the community and the government looked at the situation. I think the problem we have is it's not really just a one-off issue, though. When you see politician after politician seeming to often say quite negative things or do negative things when it comes to Muslim communities, and nothing happens on the back of it when they do these things, that's where things become very difficult. When you have a politician retweeting Tommy Robinson and sharing posts, anti-Muslim posts on their Facebook page, and hosting anti-Muslim extremists in Parliament and being part of anti-Muslim Facebook pages, and literally nothing happens to such individuals, that's a problem. When you have other members of Parliament attacking Sadiq Khan for not doing something about grooming, basically, when he's got nothing to do with it other than the fact that he's Pakistani and or Muslim. And I don't know how that necessarily links him in any way to that. When someone who votes against same-sex marriage but at the same time weaponizes that to attack Muslims in that very same way. I mean, these types of really worrying Islamophobic incidents by members of Parliament, leaders, to be honest, political leaders, is hugely problematic. And the lack of action that is being taken, this is something that is a real problem. And I think that this all needs to be thought back when it comes to the mayoral campaign a couple of years ago. And I know I often bring this up and people somehow try and dismiss it. I want to re-bring it up because I think it's important. Because the fact that when you have a campaign for the mayor of London, a national campaign in essence, because people really look at this and look at the leadership that happens in London. And you have what Conservative members of the GLA talk about being not just dog whistle racism, because everyone can hear it, so it's that loud, happening against Sadiq Khan, when you have the Prime Minister at the time lying about an imam and then having to retract that imam was linked to ISIS because he wasn't, and had to retract, and the Defence Secretary at the time having to pay libel damages because he said something very similar about that imam. All of these Islamophobic ideas happening from the leadership of a party, that is a serious problem. And there's not been an apology from the individuals concerned. It's just been brushed under the carpet. And the number of people who I've spoken to within Conservative Party and within the broader society who will never vote Conservative again because of that campaign and the lack of apology for it is huge. And that worries me. For me, the leadership, political leadership on important issues is vital. And when those political leaders actually happen to be engaging in Islamophobia for the purposes of political victory, for me that's unacceptable in any sense of the word, and it shouldn't happen.
Thank you, Chair. Many mosques and Islamic centres in the UK have been victims of vandalism, arson and threats of violence, other forms of attack. The government doubled the financial support to protect mosques and places of worship up to 1.6 million. To what extent do you think that is sufficient? And what other forms of support do you think the government might provide in practical terms, in terms of supporting security training and from a security perspective?
I think that this is a really important area. Many Muslim institutions, especially after the Christchurch attack, were really worried. And this is a time when they wanted to have change some of the attitudes that were going to happen. My local mosque, we were talking about having extra security for the first time. It's not something we'd even considered in the past. And across the country, there were very similar attitudes coming out. I think there's a few things that need to happen with, firstly, the way that the fund is currently set up. It doesn't, for example, help Islamic schools or cemeteries. It's only focuses on places of worship, whereas that's something that is a problem because Islamic schools have been attacked in a very similar way. So that really needs to be expanded to cover Islamic institutions more broadly. It's not right that it should only cover places of worship. It should be much broader than that. The second thing is the actual bureaucracy concerned in terms of how you actually apply through this process. And I'm happy to share a briefing document we've put together which sort of outlines all the key, if we like, deficiencies in the process as it currently stands. We'll send that through later. There are also big problems because there's this idea that when you apply to this fund, you have to put in 20% yourself as a Muslim institution. Mosques as a whole, half of Muslims live in the 10% most deprived areas. So you often have these mosques in areas where they struggle to pay even their imam a useful salary. They really struggle with being able to pay that 20% in the first place. So you have a range of different, if you like, barriers for the first step to apply in the first place. And then when that fund comes in place, there's also a cash flow issue. The mosque has to pay for the full amount and then get refunded, which is very, very difficult, some of these institutions. Some of these things are being dealt with. Some of the bureaucracy issues have been improved, but there's a long way to go. So I'd argue that the fund is very small for given the scale of the issue that the Muslim community is facing. But Muslim communities aren't really applying in the first place. So one of the reasons why they're not applying is not just because of the bureaucracy, it's because they don't even know about it. So the amount of money that's being put into marketing that fund or even working with Muslim organizations to ensure that people know about the fund is zero. I don't know about zero, but as in it's minimal. And Muslim organizations on the ground aren't aware of the fund in the first place. And I was on the Today program talking about this and asking why the fund was so small. And part of the answer is because Muslim communities aren't applying for it. So why expand it even further? The reason they're not applying for it is because they don't know about it. And even if they do know about it, they don't trust the people who are telling them about it. And even if they do trust it, the bureaucracy stops them from doing it. And even if the bureaucracy doesn't stop it, the money does. So you put all of these things together and you think, well, that's why people aren't applying. And these same issues aren't being dealt with. And we have raise these issues with the Places of Worship Fund. I think there's definitely some movement, and there seems to be real willingness for some of this stuff to change. And my hope and my expectation is that it will get better, but we can't, if these things aren't solved, I think that the overall amount that will be accessed will be far less than actually is needed on the ground.
I think there's two funds that are being open currently by the Home Office. One of them is the Places of Worship, where actually Places of Worship can apply for security funds, i.e. CCTVs, increasing the fences, having double glaze for the glass, which is the 1.6 increase, 1.6 million increase. That applies to all places of worship other than synagogues, because the Jewish community have got a separate fund. I think the Home Office have moved in the right direction by doing consultations and going out to mosques. There is more to be done. To reaching out to other mosques and other institutions and small ones to really talk to them about the process, help them in the process, and reach out to really community organizers in these areas to reach out to mosques to apply for them. That is one element of the fund. Addressing your question on what needs to be done in terms of training, cameras and CCTVs and fences and double glaze is not always going to save mosques, right? So we need to have training in place, and that's the second fund that's opening up in July, where actually a training that will be put together and people, organizations can apply for to the Home Office to get through that process. And we, even within Talmama, we've started a national mosque security panel that brings police officers, brings community members all together to actually tailor-make a training to mosques, to institutions, to Islamic schools accordingly for their needs, because each mosque has got a different context, each mosque has got different capacity, each mosque has got different access levels, in order to deliver that basic training on really how to deal with an incident when it takes place. How do you manage an incident? Who's the person to talk to? How do you spot someone who's suspicious? What do you do in terms of this? It's not only the CCTV that is important, it's also people on the ground and communities. How do you deal with your neighbors around us? And let's not forget, one of the things that always is being left behind when we talk about securities is women. There's women sections in mosques. No one talks about the women sections. No one talks about what kind of security these women sections have. No one talks about women being trained to address this. Women sections are separate to the mosque. So what training are the women as well getting, the Muslim women getting, in order to address these issues? That's something as well that needs to be put on the table, actually being addressed. There's a lot beyond just CCTVs, which is the 1.6 million fund, that actually needs to be looked at. We work with the Community Security Trust, with a Jewish organization that actually delivers that training in order to pick up on best practices and how they've been delivering their security to synagogues and to Jewish schools in order to tailor-make them really to Muslim communities, but also from previous incidents and attacks that have been taking place on places of worship. And let's not forget today, it's not only mosques that are being attacked, it's churches are being attacked, it's synagogues that are being attacked. And it's about how do really places of worship all together work together on securing themselves, and as communities supporting each other through a turmoil time that we're all going through.
Yeah. As members of Parliament, we have different experiences based on the different, I guess, size of Muslim communities in our area. In Chesterfield, very small Muslim community, much less than 1% of the population, and the approach that they've taken is to have a very low profile. So I often, every few months, get contact from members of the public, either on the phone or on Facebook, saying, "Oh, there's a new building, some building work started. I've heard there's a mosque being built in Chesterfield." And I usually say, "No, it's a McDonald's or it's a KFC or whatever it turns out to be." But we did have a huge Mormon church built fairly recently, and there was no interest in that whatsoever. I'm certain if the same size of mosque had been built, there would have been a huge amount of controversy over that. Now, the approach that they've taken is that they have the Chesterfield Muslim Association building. It's not seen, I think, by the wider community as a mosque, although it's where Friday prayers take place, and so it means that they keep a very low profile. They do whilst they have quite good community outreach, they do it on a very quiet basis. I just wonder from your experience how typical that is. We're used to religious organisations making a great effort to encourage people in, and yet they feel unable to do that because of the hostile response and potential vandalism that it might attract towards them, which seems to me that they are unable to do the things that other religious groups would feel free to do. So to what extent is that typical of Muslim communities in much smaller, where they are much more of a minority? And to what extent does that fit in with the training that's being provided, and what does that say about the extent to which we have normalised and accepted Islamophobia, particularly in those areas where the Muslim community is very small?
I think that just one stat that's relatively useful and relevant to what you said is 43% of people, according to one poll, said they'd be concerned if a mosque was built near them. And I think that's, if 43% of people would be concerned if a mosque was built near them, that demonstrates why, when you see something come up, why people might be concerned. It's a large number, and it is quite normalised. And I think that people across the country, when it comes to Muslims, are always very conscious as to what's happening in their local area. And if they have heard of certain incidents happen in those areas, there are always people who try and say we should keep a low profile. I mean, in mosques I've spoken to, in management committees I've spoken to across the country, there have been people who have different views. Some who said, you know what, we need to be proactive, public, talk about all the good that we do in order to change the attitudes around us. And you have others who are saying, look, if we need to just keep on going about our normal business as quietly as possible. You literally see both groups in many different places across the country, and that those different people who win that battle in their executive committee will lead to a different conclusion. I think that that's a real problem when people feel that they have to be quiet because otherwise the impact will be quite large. And unfortunately, I think that attitude is not a small incidence within only a small community. I think that happens across the UK.
I think in areas where there is a small percentage of Muslim population, you tend to have Islamic centers where people tend to go to pray. We have seen that. In terms of training to be delivered equally as the training is being delivered to bigger mosques, which might be on a different scale, training should be delivered to institutions like faith schools, so Islamic schools as well as Islamic centers, because let's not forget that it's not only about the visibility of a minaret or of a crescent for people to know that there's a mosque there. It's about Muslim communities coming out from that building. It's about, we saw that with the attack on the Muslim Welfare House, Finsbury Park attack that took place. It was a congregation of Muslim communities that were there, actually Darren Osborne drove into. So let's not forget that actually it's the visibility as well that we need to look at. It's not only just the visibility of the institution, it's the visibility of the communities that we need to look at. And how do we break those barriers between the wider society and Muslim communities? Whether it's leadership within the local authority, leadership within members of parliament within these areas that would bring communities together, that would go and attend events at this Islamic center, at these institutions, and speak out about it, to bring communities together. And you kindly said that you actually always rebut the messages that it's not a mosque that is being built, but at the same time you do stand for the Muslim communities, because again, we don't want to normalize Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. We don't want people to actually be scared to showcase their own identity. And we live in a country that is very much proud of the freedom of religion and belief that we all believe in. And this is something that we should actually celebrate and more talk about and more engage with other communities on.
Can we talk more about less explicit forms of discrimination? And just first, you mentioned some of the employment rates. And in particular, I think it's 16% of Muslims will be in professional management positions against about 30% of the population at large, as well as lower employment rates and so on. How do you account for that?
There's no easy answer for most of these questions. There are lots of studies which have looked at different areas as to why employment rate is low within certain communities versus others. They often try and split things out both based on socioeconomic status, based on ethnic background, and based on faith together. What we have seen, and I think the Women in Equalities Committee, in one of the reports that came out, talked about the triple penalty that Muslim women in particular face. The fact that they are women and therefore have certain discrimination against them. Secondly, they primarily often come from an ethnic minority background. I think 90% of Muslims come from an ethnic minority background. And thirdly, their Muslim identity is also an area which is a barrier. So I think part of an issue is definitely to do with the discrimination that they may face. Some of it may be to do with familial, cultural approaches. So in some areas, in some communities, certain, for example, Muslim women, it appears to be more often are at home compared to a broader section of society. That could be due to a large number of reasons. The question really is, does that often also happen in the second generation and the third generation coming forward? And some of these studies haven't had long enough to really come into understanding what is actually the driver of these things.
Okay, but take the group. I understand there may be cultural differences for why fewer Muslims are putting themselves forward to get employment, say. But those who are and are not progressing, so social mobility is a problem there. And let's just stick with men, say. So whether it's a female issue which will be experienced by all women, who is responsible for that discrimination? Is it positive? Well, not positive, but is it proactive discrimination that an employer is taking a informed decision, as far as they're concerned, that person who happens to be a Muslim is going to be lower down the priority list for an offer for that job? Is it sort of passive discrimination that has been instilled in that person through whatever forms? Who's exercising this, and why are they exercising it?
I think that we can't be 100% sure of this, but what we can say is that there have been studies. So the BBC did a study and they tried to put applications under the name Adam and under the name Muhammad. Yeah. And 3 times as many people who got the name Adam, similar qualifications, got the interview compared to the person called Muhammad. That's clearly, if that is considered to be intentional, I mean, what else can you say is intentional than choosing someone based on their name, solely based on their name? So I think there's clearly some element of discrimination. Now, is that because unconsciously that's happening, or is it proactive? I mean, we don't know. But what we can say is the output is very clear. And there have been a number of different similar types of studies looking at the issue that even as simple as a name can distinguish between someone getting a job and not getting a job. I think that's level one, though. The real question about social mobility often happens when someone's in a job. They've demonstrated merit and capability in doing something. And the question is whether they rise up in the same way as others. You'll see, I think, in some professions that seems to happen better than in other professions. And again, we don't have enough data to look at this properly. And I think one area that I think would be great is if there would be more work and more data and more research in this space. But from what you do see is that progression seems to be more challenging. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, a report by Demos looks at this in a lot more detail when it comes to Muslims in higher levels of professional services, and when you go higher, then the proportion of Muslims gets lower significantly. Now, part of that is due to migration patterns and the fact that Muslims haven't necessarily been in some of these professions for as long. But a big part of it is because of unconscious bias, the reality of the fact that many people are in society and they have an unconscious bias about different people. Part of it is also due to the fact that some Muslims, and we can't know how many, won't, for example, be in the same social circles and won't be willing to go to a pub, for example, or won't choose to go to a pub as often as someone else. And that could be a situation where familiarity with someone helps in the promotion of that individual. There are lots of these different things together, but the problem that we have is we don't have enough evidence to say that is a thing that's really driving that difference of percentage once you're in there. All we do have is very, very clear evidence that simply by having a different name, Adam or Muhammad, you can just get significantly lower application and success rate.
And there's also a problem with students as well. So many Muslim students will achieve higher than average at school, and yet the instance of them going on to Russell Group universities or whatever is lower. So even within the educational establishment, on the face of it, there is a prejudice against them progressing too. But you just used the phrase unconscious bias.
Yes.
What point does unconscious bias become racism, discrimination, Islamophobia?
So I think that structural racism is, in essence, could be argued at least part is unconscious. I mean, structural, when you see the fact that, you're 70% less likely to have a job as a Muslim man as compared to the broader society. I've got the exact stats, I can share it in the submission that we put. Part of that is likely to be unconscious bias, the fact that people seem to not know about it. But you're right, some of it's going to be very conscious. The problem we have is we can't distinguish between the two. There's no way for us other than by real research and qualitative research by talking to employers. It's very difficult to try and distinguish between what's driving that. We look at it structurally. We look at it in society as a whole. We look at the overall numbers in the same way as the Lamy report looked at prisons and the justice system. If you stand back and say, well, what is the output? It's clearly not how it should be based on merit. Then there needs to be something done to try and resolve that.
But so what is the solution? On the names thing, we heard from the authors of the Islamophobia definition report that they'd actually tried a blind testing for getting an car insurance quote, and Mohammed became much more expensive. Now, so presumably that's a programmed computer. A computer has been programmed by somebody for whatever reason to come up with a discrimination against that person. But if you look at what we've done elsewhere for women, say, so now there is a national imperative that we have more women represented on boards of companies, the pay equality gap, the pressure for that to close or whatever. What do we have to do? Because every answer that you've given, it's we don't know, we don't have the research. What do we have to find out, to get to? How do we commission this research so that we can have a similar sort of program to say, hold on, that's not right, where apparently there's only 1% of Muslims on boards against 6% of the population, whatever it may be.
So I think one very good positive is the race equality audit that happened a couple of years ago that is being dealt with. I think the outcomes of many things that have happened from there is a very important first step. When you identify disparity within any different area and something that doesn't sound right, or the Lamy review, again, it talks about Muslims as well in terms of the fact that Muslims are overrepresented in prisons significantly. When we look at all of these individual elements, each one of those reports has specific outcomes and actual specific recommendations. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. For each individual area, there are different ways that need to be dealt with. For example, at universities, many of the universities have not spent, I don't believe, as much on access as they could or should be. And I think more of them are doing much more. And I think there's been a real push in that direction. And that has led to more people applying. I think all of these different things, and when it comes to employment, there are the people who are saying that we should have name-blind CVs sent out in the first place. That is only one step, because once you get into the door and you look different again, you might still have that discrimination. Is very difficult to do much with. But then you have the employment and the support for those who have problems in employment in terms of discrimination, the legal support that's required, the actual fact that they know what they can do and what rights they have in a situation when they feel they've been discriminated against, making sure that that's an easy process. So there are many different things, and actually, different groups like the Runnymede Trust, Demos and others have all looked at individual areas. Even the Lamy Review has looked at individual reviews, and they've got specific recommendations as to how these should be dealt with. And I think that collating all of these together is very important to try and say, let's go forward. And I think the race equality, the race disparity audit which was done, again, the outputs from there have shown a lot of disparity in lots of different areas. There are specific things that need to happen in each different area.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Miqdaad, Versi, you mentioned with great passion about elected representatives and how they have been, in some cases, very negative and anti-Muslim in their expressions on social media and so on. And the question to both of you really is that what do you feel that political parties need to do in terms of claims levied against their members and their party?
Okay, when it comes to all parties, I think that everyone talks about a zero tolerance policy for against any form of racism. That's been mentioned by different people for a long time on all parties and from all backgrounds. I really dislike it when people say things like that, when at the same time the evidence demonstrates the exact opposite. And I'm going to talk only about Islamophobia because that's an area which I've looked into. I'm not going to be talking about other areas because that's not what this is about. And we have seen unequivocally failures within specifically the Conservative Party when it comes to Islamophobia. Not just small failures, fundamental failures in every single way. I'm talking about leadership within the party when it comes to, for example, the mayoral election. I'm talking about issues when members of parliament have done certain things and no action's been taken against them. I'm talking about when councillors and representatives of the Conservative Party have said or done things which are inappropriate and unacceptable, and sometimes have had action taken against them, and sometimes no action taken unless and until the media have been called, at which point action was done. And then what happens? A few weeks later, they're quietly let back into the party. These types of things are unacceptable. You have policies which seem to be made off the hoof. For example, the idea that any time someone shares something which is clearly Islamophobic, they will be suspended. That was a view that the chairman of the Conservative Party, Brandon Lewis, said publicly in The Guardian. A few weeks later, the exact thing happened. That same thing happened. A councillor was found to have said something unacceptable. Was that person suspended? No. This is a fundamental failure of process. There's a fundamental failure of the fact that this is an important issue. There's a I think there is this idea that this is not a problem for us. And I think that is unacceptable. We need to be fully cognizant of where things are going wrong so things can get better. And until and unless there is that acknowledgement that there is a serious problem, there will never be a solution taken. And I'm talking... Who knows about these issues? I mean, as a Muslim Council of Britain, actually, a couple of years ago, I was at this committee and I raised this as a concern. And, people said there wasn't enough evidence. We now have a significant amount of evidence demonstrating that. I put together the submission for the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and anyone can look at it and see the hundreds of cases that are out there which demonstrate the scale of the problem that is there within the Conservative Party. That's not saying that there's nothing happening in other parties, but I'm focusing on where the specific and large-scale issue is. And all I think that needs to be done is listen to those who know. Listen to the victims of Islamophobia. Listen to those who have been in the party, who are passionately supportive of that party. Look, there's a Conservative Muslim Forum. The founder, Lord Sheikh, he's someone who's talked about this consistently and talked to the Prime Minister and wrote to the Prime Minister asking for action to be taken and an inquiry to be taken. The current chair of the Conservative Party Muslim Forum, same thing. The youth chair of the Conservative Muslim Forum, same thing. They've all raised this as serious concerns. Baroness Versi, who's the chair of the party, who understands what happens at the dinner table in the polite parties that are there, she knows what the kind of words that has been used against her within those circles. And many of these individuals tried to do this in private before. But what is very clear, unfortunately, is that unless something is public, unless something is high profile, it will be swept under the carpet. And that's just not something that's appropriate.
Thank you.
I think with political leadership comes responsibility. And whether it's a one individual that is promoting racist language or 10, they're both equally bad. Okay, so it's not about just the scale, it's about the existence of racist language in any political party. I think political parties should be clear on their communicating on the process on how they're dealing with racism within their own parties. They should be transparent on outcomes and what's happening, and that's something we haven't been seeing from the political leadership in parties. And how are they addressing this problem that they're facing? What are the measures that have they taken place to address this problem for the future? I think as well, training and policies need to be revised and need to be put in place. The climate of where racism is and hatred is today is different the way it was a year ago. It's different the way it was in 2016 following Brexit. So every single day or every single few months, these things need to be revised. These things to be looked at. The context of what things are happening need to be looked at and revised. And when issues are being raised by communities, they need to be taken seriously. Because with leadership, I said, comes responsibility. And when leadership comes with language that is racist, that language emboldens the individuals on the street to actually take that hatred on a street level. It becomes, well, my political leader is saying this, so I'm allowed to say this. They become more emboldened to take that hatred on the street. And the impact of that is really on the day-to-day victims. And how do we do that? It goes back to the political leadership and how they're addressing it. But I think from the different leadership and the different political parties, there has been no communication really what the processes have been. There has been no transparency of what actions have been taken. Even when people have raised things, again, it's not equally addressed in the same manner. And no policies have been shared. When training has been offered by different entities and organizations, the proposal has not been taken on board. And unless you do this, you're not going to have the trust of the communities to actually take you into account as a political leader.
So can I just add one thing that what is worrying for many Muslim communities on the ground is the fact that is there, maybe unconsciously, a situation where Muslims are not going to vote for us, being considered as an approach. I am not saying there is any evidence. Well, no. The evidence I put on the table is the fact that, according to the University of Manchester, I think cited in the Times editorial, only 11% of Muslims voted for the Conservative Party at the last election. 11%. Muslim communities, like every community, you'd expect to vote for every party. In fact, many Muslims would consider to be socially conservative, and in many senses, you'd expect that number to be significantly higher. And you just don't see that. And at the same time, you see a situation where, according to the Hope Not Hate state report in 2018, they found that almost 50%, I think it was 47% of Conservative Party voters thought Islam was a threat to the British way of life. Now, when you look at that, and you're thinking as Muslim communities on the ground, what's happening here? Why is that so prevalent within that voter base? And are there people who are trying to play to that voter base? That's what's really worrying. Because if that happens, we've seen what happens in America. We've seen what happens when certain people play to prejudice. We've seen it in many sections of Europe, where certain elements of the far right have gained this because they've played to that prejudice. People worry that's happening here. And when you see a councillor on the ground, or even a member, suspended for sharing, for example, a tweet from Tommy Robinson or Stephen Yaxley Lennon, but an MP who does that, no action is taken, you wonder what's happening. Why is this happening? Why are there different levels for different people? Why is there lack of process? So there are real concerns on the ground, and my hope, my real hope, is that this will be taken seriously. The people who are trying to give sincere advice to make this better are listened to. Because if that happens, we will be able to have a politics which is not worried about bigotry, but voting for people based on policies, which is what needs to happen.
Thank you very much. One of our last meetings, we've been discussing the definition of Islamophobia proposed by the APPG on British Muslims. What are your views of the definition, and what is your understandings of the expression of Muslimness? And do you think the definition is helpful, and if not, how it could be improved?
Okay, so we within Salmama, we welcome the fact that the APG and British Muslims have taken the initiative to actually take evidence, do consultations to try and get a definition of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. This is definitely warmly welcomed from our end. Sure. What we do within our work and what we believe in, that any definition of anti-Muslim hatred and Islamophobia should always center the voices and the experiences of Muslims and of victims. This is what we do within our work. This is the role that we play, is supporting the victims of hate crimes. And any adopted definition must defend the right of Muslims to live freely without fear and prejudice, from violence, discrimination, while at the same time ensuring that the core principle of freedom of speech is protected and the fundamental rights are protected. But there's a clear distinction when we talk about freedom of expression and when we talk about the freedom of speech, is that, and the clear and distinctive line is that where hate translates against Muslims, their institutions, their rights and employment chances and other real life matters, that also affects their emotional well-being and mental well-being. And that's something that we need to look at when we balance the freedom of expression element and really how it's impacting Muslim communities. One of the things as well we need to look at, we work within the standards of the law, and we need to look at a definition that really relates to the laws and legislations that we have in place around hate crimes and hate incidents. And when we look at issues around intra-Muslim hatred, so we do get reports from the Shia community, we do get reports from the Ahmadiyya communities, we think that a definition should have an element of intra-Muslim hatred that to be included in that definition, because let's not forget all the work that has started in the UK around racism, all the work that has started in the UK worked around the Macpherson recommendations. And if we refer to the Macpherson recommendations, everyone has the right to self-identify with what they see themselves, correct? And as such, hate incidents are recorded. So when an individual who's from the Shia community or the Ahmadiyya community goes to the police and says, I have been attacked for me being Muslim, it is logged as such by police forces. And that is something that we always have to take into account. There's a crossover when we talk about intra-Muslim hatred and hate crimes, and that's something that we need to take into account. And we need to ensure that Macpherson is the fundamental principle that we must adhere to, and the self-identification of victims is key, because as such the law is, as such police will record it, and as such victims will actually identify and be proud of the identities they carry.
The Muslim Council of Britain has very warmly welcomed the definition proposed by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims. I think that what we've realised is that the debate is very clear when it comes to those who look at this issue very clearly, who've been looking at this issue for a long time. The idea that Islamophobia is a type of racism is very well established within academia. I mean, basically everyone knows it is. There'll be some people who try and pretend and say, oh, there's legal issues to do with it. It's not a relevant and useful discussion. Just one thing to bear in mind, and in case people weren't aware, that in December 2016, Sajid Javid said the government believed that while the anti-Semitism definition was legally non-binding, it was nevertheless an important tool for criminal justice agencies and public bodies. So it's very clear that you don't necessarily need to have a legally binding definition when we're talking about this. What we care about is trying to find out a way of identifying what something is. And the Islamophobia definition does that very clearly. It's a type of racism. Now the question of whether it is what its target is, because when you try and understand and define something, it's very important to try and understand what that target is of that racism. Now, some people would say what you need to do is be very clear and talk about every single type of racism that exists. Oh, there are these racist tropes, there's structural discrimination and institutional discrimination, there's elements to do with the way that people talk about the attacks, which are hate crime elements, all of these different sections of racism. But we already know, we know what racism is. We know what anti-black racism, we know what anti-Asian racism is. These are things that happen. We are aware of how racism manifests itself. So the only question is, well, what is the target that is different that makes this Islamophobia rather than something else? And that is very clearly some element to do with one's Muslim identity. And it could be Muslim individuals, it could be people who, it could be mosques, it could be Qurans. I think Wes Streeting, who was at this committee a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the fact that if people were burning Qurans and then videoing it for a far-right manual, that would be Islamophobia, clearly. So there has to be something more than just being a Muslim which is a target. Because guess what? Sikhs get attacked. An MP, Tamajid Desi, got attacked, or his friend, I believe, got attacked outside the Houses of Parliament because a racist didn't know that a turban wasn't an identifier of a Muslim but of a Sikh. So clearly you need to have something which is some sort of broader idea rather than just saying Muslim as the target, but actually some sort of expression of Muslim identity or Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And again, I think the best way is to look at the IHRA definition. When it comes to the website, it says at the end, criminal acts are anti-Semitic when the targets of attacks, whether they're people or property, like buildings, schools, places of worship and cemeteries, are selected because they are or are perceived to be Jewish or linked to Jews. Now, linked to Jews, one could argue, it's a huge idea. No, but people know what this means. We already understand the idea of Muslim identity. A Quran is clearly a type of Muslim identity, and clearly that painting, I'm not sure what it's not painting. The thing behind is not. I mean, we understand what this is. This is not complicated. So I think that sometimes we have to recognize that there are going to be differences of opinion when it comes to, is this a racist attack or not? Some people who perceive this as a racist attack might believe it's a racist attack. Okay. When it goes through the courts, it might be different. I'm sorry.
I'm just conscious that we need to move on to our second panel in a second. I just want to put a final sort of question to you. We're about to move on to take the first of our evidence sessions from one of the party leaderships, and we'll be taking evidence from main political parties as we did, or as our predecessor committee did, on the inquiry into anti-Semitism. You've raised, I think Mr Versi, you raised a few examples from within the Conservative Party. Can I ask you whether you have any particular examples or concerns about other parties that you would raise with us that we should be putting to those parties? You also raised you made the point about the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, having struck the right tone at the Finsbury Park Mosque at that incident. Can I also then ask you whether you have any issues, concerns or questions that you would raise about the candidates to become the next Prime Minister and anything that they may have done or said in relation to Islamophobia as well?
I will happily share with you, actually, from across all three parties, data and cases that we have identified as anti-Muslim and Islamophobic in nature. So we'll happily send you that to help you in calling the sessions. As for the candidates, I think different candidates have said different things, but one of the things definitely that we've seen following Boris Johnson's comments around women wearing the face veil was a rise in the reports that we received from women wearing the face veil, because the words letterboxes and the words bank robbers were used on the street to abuse women wearing headscarves, not only just face veil. And again, that's where I refer back to political leadership comes with responsibility, and a huge responsibility, because people will look out to that political leader. People will look out to the words that political leader is using, and people eventually will use these words on the ground and on the streets. And we do ask every single candidate that is coming out now in the leadership really to ensure that they work on communities, that they work on addressing issues within communities, but also on being responsible in the language that they use. We have many issues in the country. It's not only Islamophobia that is on the rise. We've got homophobia that is on the rise. We have got anti-Semitism that is on the rise. And we need to be careful when we talk about communities. We need to talk about the nuances that really communities care about and be responsible in our actions and what that is going to take it on the ground later on.
Does that raise concerns for you about where things go next?
I do hope that the different candidates reflect on what they have said, and I do hope that the future does not take us actually to see the levels of hatred that we've seen or racist attacks that we've seen following political leaders coming up with statements. Yes.
Mr. Versi?
I think when it comes to different parties, in the submission that we gave examples from all the various parties. We have highlighted more within the Conservative Party, but there are examples within all the parties. Anas Sarwar, for example, in the Labour Party in Scotland, has had a number of very difficult issues with the way the process has worked and how Islamophobia that he's faced has been dealt with. And I think that we should not pretend, given the scale of the issue of Islamophobia in society, the idea it's only within one party is just not true. It's across all political parties. It just happens to be a much greater incidence within the Conservative Party. And when it comes to the actual leaders, I think I echo what Iman mentioned just now, in the sense that there are real concerns that we look... when it comes to Britain, I'm very proud of the fact that, in many senses, we haven't faced the hurt that many Muslims in America have when it comes to Donald Trump being in charge. We haven't faced the same racist attacks to the same level as many areas in France and other parts of Europe. And I think that we have a very good model in many ways of how Muslim communities have been engaging with society. And people really worry that that's changing. People really worry that we might have a Trumpification to some extent of politics, where the words that you say maybe flippant words that you might have just done for the sake of writing them, or maybe intentionally to try and provoke a certain group, or maybe to try and pander to a certain section of society. Either one of those, I don't know. But where it doesn't matter when the impact and the hurt is only with a small minority of communities. And I think that is a real concern that cannot be allowed to be normalized. And where that happens, there needs to be strong solidarity from everyone that is no longer acceptable in any way in the future, or in the future that we live in.
Thank you very much for your time. We'll move on to our second panel.
Thank you very much.
to this evidence session, and thank you for coming to give evidence for us today. We appreciate your time following the evidence session that you'll have heard some of. Can you, I think, just give us your reflections on the responsibility of political parties to address Islamophobia, and also on your assessment of Islamophobia currently in public life? Sir Vince.
I'll give the first reply, and then I'll pass to Baroness Brinton, who's our party president and has been deeply involved in assimilating the definition of Islamophobia into our rules and procedures. Our starting point is that, Islamophobia, in the way that you've just been discussing it in the last hour, the prejudice and hatred directed against Muslims as a group. It's a fact of life. It has to be tackled. It's a fact of political life. It happens in political discourse. And if it's going to be tackled, there's got to be some common definition and basis for discussion. We know from many of the controversies of the last few years that between parties and within them we get a very aggressive language used against Muslims and indeed other groups too, and there has to be some basis for dealing with it. And we've taken the view that the all-party group did a great deal of work, was very thorough, consultative, has produced what we consider to be a good working definition, and we've adopted it as part of our disciplinary processes. If anybody within our party was to use what we regard as Islamophobic comments directed at other members or people outside the party, we have a basis for calling them to account. So, we felt it was. We don't feel this is the final word. We have heard the objections from Tel Mama and the Quillam Group and others. We think that as a working definition, this is a useful way of proceeding as a political party, and finding it useful.
Thank you. Yes, and I was very taken with the comments of both your previous witnesses about this sort of journey of unconscious bias through to Islamophobia. And I would want to make it clear that we don't just support the definition of Islamophobia, which is at the far end of that, but also we work through unconscious bias training of key officers in the party, returning officers, selection committees, candidates, and particularly for candidates because we have a higher standard of behaviour required of our candidates than for members. Unconscious bias will cover a range of things, but that would also obviously include Islamophobia and being aware of unconscious bias in that area. And I think I'm not aware of many cases in the discipline code, but it tends to be social media. And if it's something egregious, the advantage of social media is that the evidence is there and it's pretty clear for a disciplinary committee to then take action. It inevitably, again, and I'm sure all political parties would say this, if it's he said, she said in a debate, private debate somewhere, it becomes harder. But that's when we would go back to look at unconscious bias. We've used compulsory training to make sure that if we think somebody may have used unconscious bias but isn't aware of it, then they will be required to have training. They will be required to work with a coach and mentor who would come back and report to the chair of the disciplinary panel if they felt that this person had now understood what the issue was. And that's very different to something on social media that has moved straight into the definition that includes, hatred, intolerance, stereotyping, all of those things. Can I just add one other thing? Our members' code of conduct is very clear that this isn't just about the rights of being a member, it's also about the responsibilities of being a member. And that talks quite specifically about responsibility to others, sensitivity to others' views, so that although you have the right to be heard with understanding, you must also use that yourself as a member, not just with other members, but also to the public as well.
And just to follow up, you said something there about the unconscious bias training that you do for staff members.
For officers, members. So, for example, if you are a returning officer, or if you are chair of a selection committee or a wider selection committee, we make sure that a number of people involved in that will be trained. And under our new discipline process...
And that's for selection for candidates?
That's selection for candidates, yes. And under our new discipline process, we're making sure that our adjudicators, the discipline panel, people who are running it, but also investigators, if they are investigating a case of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, will have had specific training in that area.
Thank you. Tim Lawson.
So Vince, you heard some of the comments about what's just been referred to as unconscious bias again, in terms of employment, in terms of getting into Russell Group universities and others. To what do you attribute it, and how ingrained is it, unconsciously or proactively, in society?
Well, it's pretty deeply ingrained, I would guess. I mean, we hear it on a daily basis. The association, which is quite common, of Muslims, not just as individuals, as a group, with terrorism, has all sort of added to this colour to this phenomenon. And all the more reason for going through the kind of discipline which South Britain has just described. But, yeah, I mean, of course, it's not just about Muslims, but many other groups, not just ethnic groups, but people's size, disability, sexuality. I mean, of all these things, there is an element of bias which many of us have without realising.
Do you think it's worse for Muslims than other forms of bias?
I think so. And given the history, the recent history, it's out there. It's very obvious that it is the case. And I think the example that was cited to you in the committee hearing a few minutes ago of the Mohammeds applying for jobs or applying for insurance is a good example of how this thing comes up.
Why is it worse?
Well, I guess because of the recent history. I mean, so many of our recent domestic and international conflicts have often been framed in terms of religion, which people then attribute to a whole group of people, which they then classify in rather racial terms. And it's probably, fairly deeply rooted in our society.
So who's responsible for that? Is it the media? Is it politicians, the way they portray those conflicts?
Well, it's both of those, and it's the interaction between them, and that's why we have to be particularly careful the way we go about these things.
So what are examples of people in positions of political responsibility who you think may have exacerbated an innate discrimination against Muslims or some form of Islamophobia or potential hatred towards Muslims? Where's that being triggered by politicians? What examples have we got?
Well, if you just wanted one example, which I got involved in the public controversy around it, was your colleague's description of Muslim women as letterboxes or whatever. I mean, it may have been funny on one level, but it did undoubtedly have the effect of stereotyping a whole group of people with different motivations, and it wasn't at all helpful.
These are comments by Boris Johnson?
Yes. I mean, you asked me for an example, I've given you one. Yeah.
What exactly did he say?
I think, I haven't got the words in front of me, but I think it was describing...
Not describing all Muslim women as letterboxes, was it?
Well, that was the
so you're now
impression
generalising.
that was conveyed, that women in burqa, so the type of headdress, gave the impression as if they were pillar boxes, which was probably an attempt at humour, but certainly had the effect of... it was essentially pejorative comments on people wearing traditional wear.
And are there not examples of pejorative comments about the dress wear of other people from other cultures as well?
I can't think of any, but, and which is why the comments about Muslim women was, I think, quite provocative at the time.
So you think that Boris Johnson making a flippant, poor attempt at humour comment about the dress of certain Muslim women gives rise to Muslim hatred?
Well, prejudice rather than hatred in that particular case, yes. He probably intended it as humour and, as you say, flippant, but as you say, we are political people in positions of responsibility, and it probably helped to feed a public attitude of seeing negatively people dressed in a traditional way, which they should have every right to do so.
And that directly incites violence?
No, I wouldn't put it as far as that, no.
Okay, so where's this link which I asked for about the way politicians, the media, or other leaders link terrorism to, therefore, all Muslims must be some form of terrorists?
Well, the particular example we cited wasn't directly linked to terrorism.
Okay, so what is? That's what I asked for some examples.
Well, there have been examples within, the recent European elections. There's one candidate, as we know, in Lancashire, who made a point of directly associating Muslims with terrorism as a group. He wasn't elected in the event, but I think that kind of discourse makes it very clear that there is this prejudice out there and some people respond to it.
Baroness Brinton, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, I mean, I think personally from my perspective, I've talked to a number of Muslim women after Boris Johnson made that statement who commented that they had insults thrown at them on the street. It was as if a senior politician saying something had given permission for others to be offensive. And I think that's where it's worrying for me, because we can struggle to find a link through to extremism, to terrorism. But actually, the moment a remark is made by someone in senior life that gives others the feel they have the right to insult people they don't know on the street because of their dress, for me, that's heading dangerously close to Islamophobia.
So how would you compare that with a comment by, say, a former Lib Dem here, Baroness Tongue, who said that she sympathised with suicide bombers, she understood suicide bombers? Do you think that's inciting a more violent reaction than a flippant comment about dress?
Indeed it is, and indeed she was disciplined for that, and she is no longer a member of the party, and that is not unconnected.
So why did civilians draw on a single episode of comment on somebody's dress rather than what I would deem to be a far more serious, and I acknowledge that she is no longer a member of the Lib Dem party? That was a very serious and dangerous comment to make.
It's obviously a whole spectrum.
But comments like that are clearly not acceptable, and that doesn't mean that other comments are also not unacceptable. They may be of a different range. But when I have talked to young women who have said that they have been verbally abused on the street because of their headwear, frankly, if people feel they were given permission to do that by a senior politician saying it, then that is at the very least to be regretted.
So do you agree with the comments we had just now that the Conservative Party is in some way institutionally Islamophobic?
I think you need to do your own investigation. I haven't seen all the detail. If we had somebody who had said that, then there is no doubt that we would have received complaints and our discipline system would have kicked in, regardless of them being a senior high-profile parliamentarian or not, hence the case you raise about Baroness Tong, where our system did kick in with the whips and the laws.
Okay, but and one could say it didn't kick in with the former Lib Dem Member of Parliament for Bradford, but do you think, Sir Vince, that there is institutional Islamophobia within the Conservative Party?
I don't know until you investigate it properly. I mean, my views, I'm from a competing party, I'm probably not objective about this, but Baroness Versi, who was my cabinet colleague for 3 years and is a colleague of mine with professors at my local university, has said publicly that she feels her party, I think she's still a member of the Conservative Party, are institutionally Islamophobic, and that it would be helpful if you had this definition and you tested your own conduct according to it.
Do you think the Conservative Party not having adopted your party group's recommendation of the definition of Islamophobia suggests that there is institutional racism Islamophobia within the Conservative Party now?
Well, I don't know what the reasons are, but it does suggest a rather defensive and unnecessarily defensive response. I'm sure there are individual cases. We've had cases. The Labour Party have had cases, and surely we should be open about it and be open to internal criticism and examination.
But the Conservative Party hasn't said there shouldn't be a definition of Islamophobia. The Conservative Party has said so far it doesn't agree with the suggested definition of Islamophobia.
So if I could just comment here, I mean, I think I do regret. I wish that the Conservative Party would do it.
Why?
The discussion between the political parties under the guidance of the Committee for Standards in Public Life about the intimidation of candidates at elections. We are all trying to move to a common standard. And if Islamophobia and anti-Semitism become part of the forms of intimidation, then actually it is something that it would be good if there was one standard to which we could all agree. It may not be possible, and that is entirely within the right of the Conservative Party to say that it isn't. But if we're starting to have those discussions cross-party, then this sort of thing ought to be on the table, and I would much rather we all had common standards.
But you do acknowledge that a reason that the Conservative Party has not officially adopted that recommendation is because it has serious concerns, as were exposed when we had the witnesses from the all-party group, about just how flimsy that definition is and could be counterproductive, and that is the real reason it hasn't been adopted, and that the Conservative Party is keen to find an alternative definition which is far more robust and does not rely on a highly questionable adjectives of Muslimness, which would be very difficult to uphold in any court of law.
I think it is it's the target's expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness is helpful. It covers the point that was raised by the witness earlier about those of other religions being assumed to be Muslims. But for me, the key is, particularly with the evidence that you took from my colleague, we don't see this, as far as the party is concerned, for us internally, as requiring a criminal standard. What we're looking for is something which is more akin to employment standard of proof rather than criminal standard of proof. That means that we can hold our members to account when they do fall short of that, whether it is full-blown Islamophobia or unconscious bias and all the range in between. And that's why we want to be able to do that. I think I would urge the Conservative Party to consider that, and also to make sure that they investigate and respond to the cases that I know many of which are still outstanding, in the same way that people urge us to do so, and we will do so as well. And by the way, can I say, I don't think that we ever believe that we're going to solve this problem. What we have to do is to show that we've got the mechanism to tackle it when it comes up on a case-by-case basis.
Reported in the week after Boris Johnson's article referring to letterboxes a significant spike in hate incidents against Muslim women. Would you regard that as being significant? Do you think that we should be taking into account the consequences, not just the intention, of politicians' actions?
Absolutely. And I think part of the insidiousness of discrimination, whether conscious or unconscious, if it means that Muslims feel uneasy about walking around in their communities, then that absolutely has to be regretted, and as a society we need to tackle that.
Jump, baby.
Thank you. Good afternoon. You've mentioned disciplinary procedures, and you've alluded to some of the processes that you'd follow. But could you just tell me, what action would you take against a party member accused of being anti-Muslim or Islamophobic?
The system is straightforward for all disciplinary things, but it goes in through a central system so that every complaint is now monitored and logged and therefore clerked, so we can monitor the progress. That's important so delays don't get built in and cases don't get lost. Under our new system, which is starting in 2.5 weeks' time, we now have a completely independent process from elected officers of the party, which has been set up over the last 2 years, and we've been training independent adjudicators and investigators, the top team of whom are all legally qualified. They will decide whether it requires further investigation, or if it's a social media comment. Actually, it's usually pretty clear, and it might go straight to a judgment or a panel hearing. And as I said, we will make sure that if it's a specific case of Islamophobia, then it would be heard by somebody who had training in that area.
And would they be Liberal Democratic members, or would they just
They will be party members, but they are not allowed to sit on party committees. They're not party officers, so they can't have influence through friends of friends who might be involved in the case.
Okay, lovely. And also, would you allow an individual who has made an anti-Muslim or Islamic comment to stand as a candidate?
We do research on candidates when they first stand. It's not always perfect, but we do that. If we discover later on that someone has made comments, then they will go back through the disciplinary system. It's slightly different for candidates. Again, there's this higher bar because we have a higher standard code of conduct for our candidates.
Lovely. Is there anything you'd like to say, Vincent?
No, we have precedents of candidates who have been disowned and no longer standing as candidates because of their past behaviour. Not specifically, I think, on Islamophobia, but certainly anti-Semitism. We had one or two cases which have been well advertised, and we've dealt with them, and those people are no longer candidates.
Thank you.
Terry Perkins.
Baroness Brinton, how many allegations of Islamophobia against members of the Liberal Democrat Party has the party investigated?
I'm only aware of about 3 or 4, not very many, but part of the problem is that we didn't collect all our complaints centrally. Some of them used to be handled by local parties and they didn't have to report in centrally. We've now got a central mechanism that's been running since January the 1st this year, so we can tell you that in the future.
And was there a particular reason why you changed that system?
Oh, absolutely, in that we needed to be able to respond to complaints of all kinds and be able to catalogue them. We started cataloguing the ones that we received centrally about 3 to 4 years ago, and it's taken that long to change our discipline processes so that we can actually get a new system in and run it all centrally.
So there's been a relatively small number of complaints that the party's investigated and...
received, I think.
Received,
yeah.
but they've all been investigated, yeah.
As far as I know.
How many Muslim Party members and parliamentary candidates does the Liberal Democrat Party have, and how? What is that as a proportion of the membership?
I can't give you those figures off the top of my head. No, I can't do it. If I'd had, I can send them into the committee if that's useful afterwards.
I think we've acknowledged that it's disproportionately small, and that we ideally should have more.
Yeah, I mean, I accept that it might not necessarily be a figure that would always be in your head, but obviously you're aware you're coming to this committee today. It would be, would have been interesting to have, for you to have investigated in advance what proportion of your membership was Muslim. Was it not something that you considered might be relevant?
Unfortunately, the way we collect our data, we don't ask about specific religion. Okay. For example, for candidates, I can give you the BME figure, but I can't give you those candidates who are Muslim. Okay. Sorry.
So Vince, would you consider the Liberal Democrat Party to be institutionally Islamophobic?
Well, not from my experience, but you know there are cases, and we're dealing with them, and we would like to have more Muslim members and candidates, and I've gone out of my way to try and encourage that because we want to be more diverse.
And from what you referred previously to Baroness Versi's comment that, and many other pieces of evidence suggesting that the Conservative Party was institutionally Islamophobic. Do you share that view from what you know?
Well, you know, there have been a lot of comments, but I think, you know, it's not my role related to do the forensic work that you would need to do to establish whether something like that is a fair comment. I followed the Lawrence inquiry very carefully when I first became an MP, and I think to make an accusation of that kind stack up, you really do need to do it properly, rather than just my giving a casual judgment on it. But certainly they as we said a few moments ago, we feel they should be investigating.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously you were a member of the senior member of Liberal Democrats at the time that they went into coalition with the Conservatives. You've been the leader for the last few years. I appreciate your standing down shortly, but if you had been the leader, or if in the future you were a senior member of the party at a time when the party was considering whether or not to go into coalition with the Conservative Party in the future, would whether or not they were considered to, or the party considered them to be institutionally Islamophobic, be something that you would consider as to whether or not you wanted to be in a coalition with them, or would it not be a factor? Well,
it would certainly be a relevant factor, but it wasn't actually something that emerged as an issue at that time. I mean, the kind of related issues like how we pursue the prevent strategy, which I was fairly closely involved with because I had overall responsibility for universities, and there was an attempt, if you remember, to put a statutory duty on universities, which I took the view that infringed free speech. So that's not directly related, but where issues of dealing with the Muslim community arose, we dealt with them robustly. But I don't think the accusation was ever made at the time when David Cameron was Prime Minister that there was institutional Islamophobia of such a scale that it prevented us working with it.
But potentially in the future, in terms of what we now know, even though you didn't know it then, do you think it would be something that a future Liberal Democrat leader would have to consider at that moment?
Yes, it would, but not just in Islamophobia. I think if any party was considered, there was reasonable evidence to consider it was Islamophobic in its nature, or anti-Semitic, or prejudiced against any other group, we would be extremely reluctant to go into a partnership with them. I think that's a reasonable summary of where we are.
Can I just to clarify, so if you get a complaint about potential Islamophobia, what is the process?
People can report, anybody can report online. There's a complaints form online that also guides people through the flow chart. If they are a victim of that, as opposed to somebody who may just have seen it, they also have access to our pastoral care officer, who is not part of the discipline process, but will support that person right the way through the process to make sure that they know exactly what's coming, and will make sure that if they're particularly badly affected and evidence is taken, they don't have to be in the same room as the person they're alleging has committed whatever it was. That then is processed. There is a decision about whether it needs to go to full investigation or whether it's very clear-cut, or actually also if mediation will resolve it. Now, I think in the example we're talking about, that's not the case, but the intention is with very minor offences which make up the bulk, they would go to mediation and never required to go to a full panel.
And who decides?
The lead adjudicator. We have a team of lead adjudicators, and they will process them, and these are the people who are legally qualified.
And the lead adjudicators, are they elected? Are they chosen by the leader? How are the lead adjudicators decided who they are?
They applied and were selected against criteria, and they are trained, and our compliance manager and her unit run the processes for them. So
it's a job. It's a fully paid position.
It's not paid. It's not paid.
It's not paid.
They're members.
So they're members from all across
Correct.
the country who apply.
Yes.
And how are they then chosen? How do you decide you're going to get it rather than somebody else?
A panel, a subgroup of members of the board and the three state parties worked together to make sure, because we also had to make sure that we had people covering all three states, because we're a federal party, and that's important. The list of lead adjudicators is approved by party conference. That happened in March, and that will happen on a regular basis as people change.
And the panel that chooses them, how's the panel chosen?
That's by nomination from members of the federal board. Again, meeting various criteria. So we'd want somebody who understood what the training requirements are, what the skill set is, somebody themselves who has legal experience, so that it's a balanced panel. And then
I think the thing I'm just simply trying to understand is ultimately who chooses in terms of the decision-making structure. I'm slightly lost.
It's this panel, which is a subgroup.
So the panel chooses your adjudicators.
Mm-hmm.
Your adjudicators have to be trained. Mm-hmm. And so just say again, and the panel is chosen how?
By the federal board.
By the federal board,
yes.
And the federal board is chosen how?
A mixture. We are directly elected or elected by appointment from one of the federal parties. But it's a range of about 35 people.
And that's the overall governing body.
And yes, it's the governing body of the...
And if questions were raised about whether or not your panel was not representative or your board was not representative, or that there was somehow, as a result of that, lack of sensitivity to particular issues,
we are
how
held
would you
to
handle
account
that?
by our party conference, which is the party's supreme decision-making body, which people tend to know that our conference makes policy, but they don't know that they approve certain positions like this. All our members are entitled to go to conference and to vote, to raise questions at conference, and they can do that. They can also, in between times, come back to either myself or their own chair of a state party and report if they've got concerns, and those get fed back.
And what's the transparency in the process? So if a complaint is made about serious Islamophobia and then somewhere along the way the adjudicator or the panel or whatever decides, actually, no, we don't think that's serious, or we think that apology is sufficient, or whatever, what is the level of transparency?
The transparency certainly goes back to the complainant, and there's discussions with the complainant, and it can be closed down. There is an appeal process if they object to that. We tend not to circulate the detail of results of most of the complaints processes, but certainly any complainant would be aware of and involved and then able to make a decision to appeal if they wanted to.
Toby, did you want to come up on something?
Yeah, so if I may, Chair, you heard the evidence from the two witnesses that we heard earlier, and one of the issues that was raised was specifically about the engagement of women from the Muslim community. Mr. Vince mentioned previously that there's a recognition and a desire to do more within the party more generally to encourage more members of the Muslim community to join. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what practical steps that has taken, and specifically what steps have been taken with regard to encouraging more Muslim women to join the Liberal Democrats.
We have the Association of Liberal Democrat Councillors runs an emerging and future leaders group, which has specifically targeted young women, young BME women, and within that young Muslim women as well. We also have a campaign for gender balance and a racial diversity campaign, who have a specific responsibility to encourage, bring forward and work with candidates from obviously women, but also from BME backgrounds, and for this purpose I would also include Muslims as well. We had run, and it's in abeyance at the moment, a leadership programme which specifically covered support for candidates from the 4 underrepresented groups as identified in the Equality Act and the Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance to political parties. And actually, if I could make a plea to this committee, the guidance to political parties is very frustrating in that whilst it's possible to have all women shortlists and all disabled shortlists, it is not possible to have all BME shortlists or all LGBT shortlists, which hamstrings those parties that particularly want to make progress in those areas. For us within our Muslim communities, we certainly work with other Muslim members to make sure that young people come forward. We have some outstanding young members in the Young Liberals who are doing exactly that. And I'm hopeful. We had one of our number elected as an MEP a fortnight ago, and we certainly have some candidates in top target seats. Perhaps in a general election where we make gains rather than losses, we'll be able to see the benefits of that in the future.
If I may say, there's clearly many issues all the parties face in terms of attracting more women into engagement in our politics, but the barriers and issues around Muslim women are different to those within others. I wonder, firstly, I invite you to consider whether what you've said is sufficient in terms of that particular group, and in terms of the kind of processes and practices that are followed by your members of parliament, by council leaders and other people engaging in the community. Would, for example, someone holding a meeting, attempting to engage with purely a male audience in a sort of Muslim setting, would that be considered to be acceptable and best practice, or and if not, what sort of steps are you taking to ensure specifically that Muslim women feel that there is a role for them in the Liberal Democrats at a senior level?
Well, I've been in that position myself as a candidate where I've been asked to address a mosque and I've been asked to address the men only, and I asked then also to be able to go and talk with the women. And I think that actually it's very much for us to show that we are there for our entire community and to work with them. We have some excellent women Muslim counsellors who also act as role models and provide support for our other young women who are thinking about becoming candidates and then running for election. Because you're right, there are some barriers. There is certainly unconscious bias. I don't think this is just a Liberal Democrat thing, and we need to make sure that they are also empowered to deal with it. One of the big things that we've been doing as a party is asking others who have had unconscious bias training, who see things, to call them out, because it's much easier if somebody else helps to call out something that is uncomfortable, asking about family arrangements, asking about dress, all of those things.
Yeah. If I could just say finally, I appreciate the example that you set when you were a candidate and recognise that, but is there anything more formal than that in terms of the guidance that you provide to members of Parliament, to other people who on behalf of Liberal Democrats are engaging with the Muslim community, other than the fact that you kind of took this action on that occasion? And if not, do you think that more needs to be done?
No, not specifically for Muslims, but we do provide specific guidance for working in different communities to one's own, because we all have a lack of knowledge which can turn into unconscious bias. So yes, we do offer that. In fact, Sarah Tether, when she was an MP, led our work in that amongst parliamentarians, and we're still doing that today.
May I just follow up a couple of things that you said in answer to earlier questions? First of all, I'm sorry if you explained this and I didn't pick it up. Is it a single complaints and disciplinary system covering all protected characteristics, or is it this been describing to the chair specifically in relation to
It is a
Islam?
single disciplinary system. It's not just about protected characteristics, it's about everything. So it covers bullying, it covers harassment, it covers a row, about which candidate might take priority over another in a list system when there's been a row between them and complaints happen. It's absolutely everything, and that's one of the reasons it's quite difficult to pull out just cases about Islamophobia, because it's not always obvious.
And
it will be in the future, by the way, but it hasn't been.
And it's obviously, as in other political parties, a self-regulatory system. Do you think that, first of all, your members, and secondly, the wider public have confidence in political parties self-regulating?
I think because our members had to approve this new system, and we consulted on it over 2 election periods before we actually implemented it. So it was discussed and debated at conference, and then it came back in a revised form, which was then approved by a 2/3 majority. I think the members understand that they've been heavily involved in it. The proof will be in how it actually develops. We automatically now build reviews into our discipline system, because the moment anything gets stuck in a rut, you can start to miss things. So that's built in, helped by the fact that our committees are obviously re-elected over periods, so all policies have to be reviewed. That will include the definition of Islamophobia, and it'll include the definition of IHRA. So as a new committee comes in, they've got to look at all of those different things.
Is that an internal review, or does it engage with external non-party stakeholders?
We have done. I can't speak for the future, but we certainly have done before we accepted this definition here.
You mentioned that you don't have data on your membership's religious faith, and I understand that, and the difficulties perhaps of capturing that information, certainly in regard to existing members. But do you have any plans to try to capture it in future?
We now have a voluntary system, but we are told we cannot insist on asking all our members to give us all their diversity data. And I think that's one of the frustrations, that I can't give that data. All I can do is to tell you those who've responded voluntarily with that. Candidates are a different matter, in that we can ask candidates because we collect data. But as I say, we hadn't specifically pulled out religious affiliation in the past.
And finally, I'd just like to ask you something about your adoption of the definition, and you've, I think, given us a comprehensive description of how you've adopted it in terms of internal party processes. But of course, the definition is not just about how political parties manage their own activities. We heard evidence a few weeks ago from Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu and from Martin Hewitt, Assistant Commissioner Martin Hewitt, from the National Police Chiefs Council, suggesting that they had concerns that the definition would act as a brake on policing, counter-terrorism policing, and would be difficult for officers to operate on the ground. I assume the Liberal Democrats are a party that aspire to return to government. Does it concern you that very senior police officers gave that advice to the committee?
I've read the evidence, and obviously I'm not a policing expert, so I can't comment on that. But I do think that what we're talking about here is actually not, in the main, it's not about counter-terrorism, it's not about terrorism. And frankly, we need to be able to recognise what's going on broadly in society, and to not accept this definition because of a very specific issue about terrorism would really, really concern me. The overlap with prevent, Sir Vince has already referred to, which I think has led cause for concern in our party, because it's important that whatever arrangements happen between the criminal justice system, between the police and the Muslim community, needs to be brought into by all parties. And if this definition doesn't help the police, then you may have to look at it again. I think I'd regret
My
that.
understanding was that the Metropolitan Police had indicated they were happy with the definition, or at least didn't consider it a problem in policing responsibilities.
Thank you. Can I thank you very much for the